This breaking news situation continues. Now, Lily Cummings joining us live outside of federal court at this hour. She has Matt Chester with her. So, Lily, what did Matt have to say about what the U.S. attorney told us just moments ago?
Yeah, so Matt was able to comb through this indictment more while that press conference was going on. What takeaways do you have now that you were able to give it a little bit more closer attention?
Kind of a lot of the same of what we first saw at the beginning. I mean, again, most of the charges appear to relate to the affair they had, the falsification of timesheets. There's a lot in here about what the government would call the obstructive conduct to lie about the affair, right? Her testimony before the grand jury, the affidavit she did, certifying her production was complete, when in reality, according to the government, she didn't produce these WhatsApp messages. So what you see a lot in here that is going to be problematic for her if this case goes to trial is the kind of after-the-fact conduct to hide the affair. Again, people might understand that, but when you're talking about federal grand juries, federal law enforcement, those are just things you typically don't mess around with, and they can be violations of federal law. So that kind of stuck out to me as I went through it a little closer.
And you said if this goes to a trial, kind of explain to folks watching from home what comes next, because people are really wondering, what does this mean for me as a citizen of New Orleans finding out that my mayor was indicted today?
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of the legal process, she's treated like any other defendant. So she's now been indicted by a grand jury. Grand jury essentially just votes to determine whether or not there's probable cause for the case to continue. They have voted, in that way. So she is now a defendant like any other defendant. She'll have what we call an initial appearance or an arraignment before a magistrate judge, probably in the next week or two. She will come in. She will, acknowledge that, she is the LaToya Cantrell that's been named in this case. She'll likely be given a bond as opposed to being detained, right? So she'll be able to leave that day. And then the case will proceed like any other criminal case. She'll have a lawyer. Her lawyer will have the opportunity to file motions, and ultimately a trial will be set, and she'll have her day in court. She'll always have the opportunity to plead guilty if she wants to do that. But if not, she'll have, like any other defendant, her day in court to be able to disprove these charges or put the government to its test to prove them.
And it's my understanding that if she does plead guilty, the council has every right then to remove her from her office. Is that true?
So my appreciation is she can resign, and if she's convicted before the end of her term, there is certain provisions in New Orleans Home Rule Charter that will allow the council to appoint somebody to fulfill her term, the remaining months of her term. Again, we're talking about 5 months left, I think, till the election, or a handful of months left till the election. So seems kind of unlikely that all of that will take place short of her resigning. But there is a procedure if she is convicted or wants to resign to appoint somebody to fill her term.
And Matt, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but talk to the folks at home. We were talking about, is this politically motivated at all? Because there will be some folks that wonder if it is.
Yeah, I mean, I can only talk from my personal experience. As hard as some of this may be to believe, particularly in our politicized atmosphere that we have here today, none of the charges, at least in my personal experience, against any defendant, Republican, Democrat, City of New Orleans, parishes outside New Orleans, were done with an ounce of politics involved. Most federal prosecutors view their job very responsibly and approach it very ethically. I would be surprised if there was any politics involved in this decision. They're there to decide whether or not federal law was broken, and if so, they're there to try to hold people to account. In this case, they made the decision that they felt this to be sufficient enough to ask a grand jury to return an indictment, which they've done. But at least in my experience, politics doesn't enter the equation.
And I want to talk about the monetary amount that's listed in this indictment for folks to really understand. It alleges that Vappy spent about $70,000 going on trips with Mayor Cantrell. But as you said, some of that could have been while he was on the clock, being her bodyguard. Kind of talk about that $70,000 number in perspective for folks to understand.
Yeah, so in federal criminal cases, a lot of what drives the ultimate disposition of a case, if a defendant is convicted, and again, every defendant is innocent until proven guilty, but if a defendant is convicted, a lot of what drives what their ultimate punishment may be is the monetary amount at issue or the loss at issue. There's references in here to $70,000, and my understanding of that, as I've read it, is that's the amount the city had to pay for for Officer Vappy to travel with the mayor. I think there's an open question as to whether all of that amount is somehow tainted or subject to being calculated as part of any sort of punishment here. Presumably, at least some of the time, Officer Vappy was providing executive protection detail, and so you might argue, if you were his lawyer, that this $70,000 figure is kind of an inflated figure. There are smaller figures in this indictment, the kind of NOPD timesheets that he was filling, the overtime, that sort of a thing that was approved. Those are smaller figures that seem a little bit more concrete to me, but certainly it's in there. The government may believe the whole thing should be tainted, and of course it'll be on them to prove that.
What is the mayor's best defense at this point?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know enough to be able to answer that. There are things about as I talked about earlier, the obstructive conduct that I think are going to be difficult for her. If she was filling out affidavits, testifying before a grand jury that she had complied with a document subpoena from a federal grand jury, and she did that falsely, those are going to be difficult things for her to kind of combat against, right? Typically, you might have a defendant say, I didn't produce these, but I didn't do it knowingly, meaning I wasn't aware of it. If I made a mistake, I made a mistake, but that's different from falsifying something, right? But as to the underlying issue, which is Officer Vappy, the affair, and his NOPD paperwork, I think if you're the mayor, and again, the facts will play out in court, query how close the mayor was to what Officer Vappy was doing with respect to those timesheets, right? Certainly it sounds like the allegation is that he filled them out, he submitted them, he got paid for that time, but the government is going to have to tie the mayor to either knowing that occurred or that it it's reasonably foreseeable as part of this conspiracy that occurred, and that's going to be a little harder. So I think if you're the mayor, you might say, look, I don't know what he did with respect to those timesheets. That might be on him, and he'll have to handle that. I was a step removed, so that could be a defense they have. But again, there's a lot we don't know yet, and it'll play out in the coming months.
I do want to ask you, in this indictment, we see some personal text messages that are exchanged between Vappy and Mayor LaToya-Cantrell. We also see some photos, pictures of rings. We see pictures while they're on some of these trips. What level of privacy does she have now that this is out there? I mean, this indictment is public record.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think I have two minds about that question. The first is, she's a public official, right? And if she is out there doing the public's work, then, undertaking official business, there's an argument that those are the public's emails. Those are the public's communications. They are entitled to know that, right? She is being paid by the citizens of New Orleans. So I think that there's part of this that you can understand encompasses her public office, and the citizens would have a right to kind of get some of that. We all are also private individuals too, even politicians. And this is what we were talking about earlier. There's something about this case that's kind of so intimate between the two of them, right? That to answer your question, does she have a right to privacy? I think to a limited extent. She's a public official, so she gives up some of that right. But I think if you're her lawyer, one of the defenses I assume her capable lawyer is going to make is they had an affair. They made a mistake. They didn't want it to become public for a variety of personal reasons. And again, this is something we chatted about earlier. People tend to understand that, okay? That doesn't make it right. That doesn't even make it legal. But people tend to understand that. So certainly this is part of the government's evidence. I expect this and probably lots of other text messages or WhatsApp messages will come out. But it's kind of a mixed picture as to whether she's entitled to some level of privacy, and even if she isn't, whether a jury might have some sympathy on that point.
All right, and 15,000 was the number of WhatsApp messages that they said that they read through in this indictment. Matt Chester joining us here at federal court with an update on this indictment. Katie, we'll send it back to you in the studio.
I think one thing that's really significant that the U.S. Attorney's Office pointed out related to something that Matt said was that Cantrell did not take a bodyguard with her on some of those trips that Vappy could not attend. So that kind of goes to Matt's point about whether or not, he was working as a bodyguard or kind of what the intent of the trip was. So essentially saying if Cantrell didn't need a bodyguard at all, why was Vappy there? Maybe worth asking Matt about that.
Yeah, so Katie's saying that on some of the trips it's noted that Mayor Cantrell did not have a bodyguard, and then she obviously has Vappy with her sometimes. Does it say something that she didn't necessarily need a bodyguard for certain trips?
Certainly, and that's going to be the government's position, right? The argument here, kind of diffusing what I had said earlier, is going to be, if you really needed him for executive protection, how come on these 3 or 4 or 5 other trips you didn't bring him along, right? And so the kind of reading between the lines there, or the deduction there, is going to be you brought him along not for any executive protection, but you brought him along as a personal companion. And I think that there's going to be some force to that. The government put those allegations about those other trips where he wasn't involved for a reason, and I'm sure it's that one.
Matt, we've seen our city council take steps to, ban alcohol that's reimbursed that city officials drink, right? We've seen them try ban travel and things like this. Do you think that now that this indictment is here, it's in black and white, we're able to read what exactly she's alleged of doing, that maybe the city council will go back and add some ordinances that kind of restrict public officials more?
Yeah, I mean, kind of as I think about this indictment, right, again, the underlying conduct is an affair, which violates, according to the indictment, NOPD policy. It violates kind of other policies and governing public officials in the city of New Orleans where there's public dollars at play. So it's not like there aren't these sorts of ordinances already in place. They are there. I don't know kind of what you can do from a city council standpoint to prevent people from having affairs, right? So I think that there are some of those ordinances. Certainly, as you mentioned, the council has taken steps in recent months and years to rein in the purse strings and the ability of the mayor to spend public dollars. That might be worth looking at. Maybe some guardrails around the use of executive protection, which does cost the city some money. Those are things I think they could look at, but at the core of this case is it's an affair between 2 people. Hard to kind of govern that.
Sure, absolutely. All right, Katie, we will send it back to you from federal court. Thank you, Matt, so much for answering all our questions.
Yeah, Lily, thank you. That's great stuff from him. And, I think there are so many questions that remain about this situation that we're going to be asking them in the days and weeks to come. But I think one of the biggest questions that we have now is, what will Mayor LaToya Cantrell do? She has dug her heels in every time she's faced one of these controversies, proclaimed her innocence, strongly, vehemently denied that any of this was related to covering up an alleged affair or related to any personal business. She has continued to maintain that this was travel that was legitimate. It was, to move the city forward and to do the city's business.